This is another supplement to the truncated 2020 Colorado Master Gardener Entomology Training Program, and this is a different kind of topic. It's on how you could garden to affect populations of certain kinds of insects, often insects that you might perceive as being important, things like butterflies or moths, such as a hummingbird moth, as well as natural enemies and biological controls. There's a second part that I'll do later, and that is going to be just on bees. And there is a handout that goes along with this. I hope you can access this the same way you can access this uh, YouTube. So basically, the idea here is that the kinds of plants you do put in your garden can support populations of desirable species, and they also, in some cases, may contribute to incidence of pests that limit plant value. We're going to emphasize mostly the ones on the left here. And the kinds of things we're talking about that could be affected could be, again, butterflies, could be honeybees, could be bumblebees, could be nuisance invaders that come into your house, natural enemies, and we'll cover most of these in these two sections right here. So basically, the way you have to think about landscaping for insects is think about what do they need? What do the insects need to get through life? And often it's fairly simple. They're going to need some food for when they're growing up, and they're going to need some food for when they're an adult, and they may need some shelter, particularly if they're one that produces some sort of nest. So, food needs for the young. We've got food needs for our young, and food needs, bugs have got food needs too. So, for example, when we're talking about butterflies, the part of butterfly gardening that's most important is what kind of plants can be put in the landscape to support the caterpillar stages that turn into the butterflies or moths or whatever we're talking about here. And in this case, painted lady, it would be certain kinds of thistles or hollyhock, mallows, sometimes some legumes, but whatever they need. Food needs for the adults. Adults often feed on some different things, and for instance, many of the predators, many of the natural enemies we'll talk about, will, in the adult form, be feeding on nectar and pollen rather than developing by feeding on insects. And shelter needs, not as commonly a need or widespread a need, but there are certain species and examples when we get to the bees might be providing cavities for certain cavity nesting kinds of insects, such as a leafcutter bee. There's also shelter needs among some of the hunting wasps, but these would be ones that rear their young in some way. Now, this whole idea of landscaping for insects starts with butterfly gardening. I mean, in the beginning, that's what we were talking about. And the insect that got me into it is an insect shown here. It's called the parsley worm, my gateway bug to the idea of landscaping my yard in purposeful ways to bring some insect action to my yard. So this is an insect, the parsley worm, that you'll find on parsley, dill, fennel, and it's a very colorful insect, fairly large insect. It lays its eggs on these plants, and you can see a couple eggs there on dill. The young larva kind of looks like a little um, uh, bird poop, a little bit of bird poop. It's black and white. When it gets bigger and can't get away from with looking like bird poop, then it becomes very brightly colored, and it will might be an inch or so long. This large caterpillar again is quite an attractive insect, I think, but it's also an insect that has a little interesting angle to it because were you to bother it shows an interesting behavior. So this is an insect that I like to have when my kids were young. It eats a lot of parsley, it eats a lot of dill, but how much parsley, dill, and particularly fennel do we need? Just plant more. And it is an interesting caterpillar that my kids would collect when they were young. I mean, they're bored in the summer. What to do? Well, hey, there's some parsley worms out on the dill, and they would go out there because it is that attractive looking caterpillar. But more important, in terms of interest, is that when you bother them, when you pick them up, when you poke them, boop, these smelly little horns pop out from behind the head, and this is a gland that will evert like it's shown here, and then it reverts back into the body, and it's got an interesting odor. Kids like to check things out like that. So anyway, I think that makes it a insect certainly worthy of having in my yard. Now, with this case, if we had this parsley worm after the kids were hassling it, I'd say, well, leave them alone, put them back in the plant, and let them finish off. And if everything went well, when full grown, the caterpillars would move away, retreat somewhere. They would attach themselves with a little girdle around the middle and at the base of the body of the caterpillar, shrink up, and then pupate. And they would pupate in the form of a chrysalid, a chrysalis, the pupal stage of a butterfly. So this is going to be a butterfly. The chrysalid is often blends in very well with the background too. It shows it better on that picture on the right, but often it takes on the same background color. Now, we have this parsley worm, and then the adult form is also a very attractive insect. And the adult form of the parsley worm is the black swallowtail, one of the largest butterflies we have. The swallowtail butterflies do include our largest butterflies, and this is a dark colored one. Many of the others are going to be yellow and black. So this gets into butterfly gardening, and what are the principles of butterfly gardening? Fairly simple. What do the adults feed on? What do the young feed on? The caterpillars. Avoid using harmful insecticides, obviously, on the plants that these insects are visiting. And for some, they might have a mud puddling habit. I'm not going to get into that, but some butterflies will visit damp spots in a garden or out in the wild anywhere, and these are to collect salts and moisture. Males are the only ones that do that. Anyway, so the obvious thing is the food needs by the butterflies. What do butterflies feed on? Well, nectar. We see them at flowers, but they also feed on some other things. But nectar. And there are certain kinds of plants that are visited heavily by butterflies and others that are not. And they're usually a fairly large flower, not always, but they have a lot of nectar and it is accessible for them. They've got quite long mouth parts, and so these would be some annual plants. I mean, these are just examples of annual plants you might put in your yard that are attracted to butterflies. I like larkspur. I like zinnia. Those are two of my favorites. Get swallowtails on them a lot, and they pose, and they really like them. But again, you'll find plants that they like in your yard too. And then there's perennial plants, butterfly bush, some of the milkweeds. Milkweeds are all really good. The thistles, almost anything in the thistle family. New England aster, late in the season, lots of good action on that. Anyway, again, there's various perennial plants that can be used. So here we see the swallowtails on my butterfly bush, and then swallowtails on a milkweed. It's often useful when you do plant flowers to attract butterflies to put them in a fair mass. Now, if you had a good bush that had multiple flowers, that might just be quite attractive of itself. But if you're growing annual flowers or herbaceous perennials, you might wish to have a large number of them in a group to make it more attractive and to retain the butterflies for longer in the garden site. So, obviously, nectar and certain kinds of flowers are things you want to consider including in your yard, but there are other things that other butterflies feed on. Not all butterflies might be feeding on nectar. Often they will feed on some other kinds of things. So, for instance, the most widespread, most abundant family of butterflies that we have, the Nymphalidae, the brush-footed butterflies, these often visit non-nectar sources too if they're available. So here, for example, I have a picture of a hackberry butterfly and a dead raccoon, and I have a butterfly and a honeybee. Now that butterfly is not a brush-footed butterfly on wild hog droppings, and they're taking the fluids and some of the salts off these. Now, I'm not saying you should have dead raccoons and wild hogs running around your backyard, but others might be feeding on fruit, on overripe fruit. This is and ooze, plant ooze from plants. So sometimes, and you could prepare concoctions, perhaps of overripe fruit, maybe mixed with a little beer. Mush bananas are good. You'll see these kinds of things if you ever visit a butterfly pavilion, butterfly house. They'll often have little trays of these kinds of foods because many of the butterflies in a butterfly house are feeding a lot on plant sap or overripe fruit. But the big part in terms of butterfly gardening, I've always thought, is not what kind of flowers should you plant to attract the adults, but real butterfly gardening is where you can build up the populations of those butterflies by planting the plants that the caterpillars develop on. Now, these, the butterflies, they're sipping on nectar, but if there's nothing for the caterpillar to feed on, then the female will go somewhere else. I mean, she's got a job to do. She's looking for the right kind of plants to lay her eggs on so that her young will develop. And if they're not around, she doesn't stick around long. She may sip some nectar, but then passes on to look for the plant. So we want to look for what kind of foods the caterpillars feed on. And one of the things you could use as a resource is this fact sheet we've had. This is the very first extension fact sheet in the country. It goes back to the early 1980s. Anyway, it lists some of the common butterflies we have here in Colorado and what are some of the caterpillar foods that they will feed on. So, for example, that black swallowtail butterfly, which happens to have a separate name, the parsley worm, when it's young, feeds on parsley, dill, fennel, and a couple other carrot family plants. The two-tailed swallowtail butterfly, this is the biggest swallowtail that I have in my yard here in Fort Collins. That one develops on trees, and trees like ash, in particular green ash, chokecherry as well, hop tree. And if you're in western Colorado, there's a western tiger swallowtail that feeds on chokecherry, ash, aspen, and willow. These swallowtails, by the way, all of them have behaviors to try to trick predators, such as a bird. So in the case of this tiger swallowtail, the eggs are laid, and then you have young, and the young look like bird droppings again in this case. When they get bigger, in the case of the two-tailed swallowtail, it has a different habit. It will have an appearance that might have these eye spots, back of the head, that kind of makes them look kind of snake-like or scary. And then if you bonk them on the head, boop, smelly little horns come out. I mean, all the swallowtail larvae do that. If you see that habit, you know it's a caterpillar, some kind of swallowtail. Then there's, of course, the monarch, the butterfly that everybody talks about, and it's certainly got a wonderful story, a migrant and interesting life history. Very good-looking butterfly. There are plants that can support it. The monarch, as you may know, is a butterfly that has larval stages that develop on certain kinds of milkweed, and certain kinds of milkweed are pretty good for developing monarch, supporting monarch larvae. So these would be a couple: Asclepias tuberosa, Asclepias incarnata, also the common lilac, and the Asclepias curassavica. That's one that would not overwinter around here, but that's a good plant that can support the larvae. So yes, if you want to have monarchs, you could have flowers that would attract the adults, but then you would want specifically milkweeds to support the larvae. Now, that being said, everybody wants to talk about monarchs, and it is a fantastic insect, but I hate to say it, we are not players in the monarch real players in the monarch business. I mean, the monarch has a flight path that barely skims into Colorado. There's a few that might come in from the west, from a much smaller western population of the monarch, but the main part of North America gets colonized from ones that fly up every year about this time from Mexico, where they spend the winter, and we get just a tiny shade of them. We might see a few of them in our yards, but um, if you want to support monarch butterflies, go live in Iowa. We are not big players. Um, and the monarch, again, is a very attractive insect, but it is also commonly mistaken for a butterfly that is far more common around here, and that is the painted lady, and that's got a pretty good story too. Painted lady is the uh, most common, most widespread butterfly on the planet. I've seen it in Madagascar. I've seen it in Tanzania. I've seen it in New Zealand. Um, in the United States, where it is presently being found at this time, where this is April 1st, would be somewhere in the southwestern part of the United States and northern Mexico areas adjacent to that. They are developing year round on their hosts, but they retreat back to these areas. And so, at about this time of the year, if you want, you'd find them down in southwestern, or excuse me, Southern California, and they have their generations through the winter there, and then they may build up in large numbers. So a year ago, we're talking now 2019, you may have caught that there were a lot of stories, most in Southern California, of huge numbers of painted ladies, and that's because in 2019 there were good winter and spring rains that allowed the plants on which the painted lady developed to surge in numbers. So then there were large numbers of painted ladies coming out of that area in 2019. We'll see what happens this year. And then sometime in late May, early June, they take off and they will migrate right across Colorado, sometimes in spectacular numbers. And they'll keep going. Some of them will stick around here, and some of them will keep going. When they get into Colorado, you might see some of them looking a little faded. Some of them maybe had a accident with a bird. The colors are less vivid as they lose more scales in their flight. It's often a rough correlation to how old the butterfly is. And by midsummer, these butterflies have colonized essentially all of North America. And then in late summer, they retreat back to the winter grounds, and we don't see them over winter here. So this is an annual migrant that originates from areas of northwest Mexico and southwestern United States, and you will find this developing on things like thistles and hollyhock and mallow. The young stage is actually even called the thistle caterpillar because it's so common on many kinds of thistles, including Canada thistle. Some other butterflies we have, the variegated fritillaire, that's the one I saw most often last year. Mostly it was on flax, which I have not listed as a larval host plant here. I should, but pansies, viola, as well as some other plants that are indicated here. That's a very common butterfly here. Down in the southwestern part of the state, you might get the Arizona sister that develops on oak, or the common buckeye we see in the state developing in things like snapdragons, toadflax, the Melissa blue, various legumes, the ruddy copper, plants in the buckwheat family. Anyway, whatever kind of butterflies you're interested, you want to learn a little bit about what kind of plants would support them, and then consider introducing them in your yard. Couple things though. Now, one of the things that comes up with butterfly sometimes is this idea of butterfly houses, presumably to provide some sort of shelter for butterflies. Do butterfly houses provide benefits? I have never heard of anyone seeing a butterfly in a butterfly house. I don't get them. So, do they provide benefits to to butterflies, I think very dubious value. Help. Probably won't help hurt, but I don't think they'll help. Furthermore, some of those butterfly houses may be used by wasps, in particular paper wasps. And there is one paper wasp that is a game changer species in this state. European paper wasp was first found in eastern Colorado in 2001. It was first found in western Colorado a few years before that, in 1998. And this is now our common paper making wasp. It makes these cells out of paper that are not enclosed and in an envelope like a bald-faced hornet would, and you might find them, underneath the eaves or in your Weber grill, or all sorts of places, particularly attached to weathered metal or wood. Anyway, European paper wasp is a species that feeds its young live insects that it chews up into bug burger. And this insect has become extremely abundant in urbanized areas in much of the state over the last decade and a half. And it is eating a lot of caterpillars. So these paper wasps of all kinds, and this is the most common paper wasp we have, feed their young freshly killed insects. And they'll make these nests, and the European paper wasp happens to be one that's yellow and black. And it has had huge impacts, I think. I mean, it's introduced a new stinging insect, although it's not nearly as important as a stinging insect as is the native western yellow jacket, but that's another story. But one of the big things that I think has had an impact is many areas have seen caterpillar populations just be devastated. Certainly happening in my yard, and has for 15 years now. There are certain kinds of caterpillars that formerly I used to see, others used to see more commonly in their yards. Say cabbage worms that would be feeding on cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower, things like that, or tomato hornworms, common in tomatoes. These are things that are often far less common than you would have seen before this insect established itself in the mid 2000s. And these are pretty much gone. I mean, cabbage worms are something I used to talk about for Master Gardener all the time, and I don't do it anymore because it's not nearly as important. Other things are more important. That one dropped out because of the European paper wasp, at least in many places of the state. But I hate to say it, it's also affected butterfly gardening in areas where the European paper wasp is common. This insect that I love, the parsley worm, the turns into the black swallowtail. I still plant parsley and dill to see if they'll come, but I'm of two minds now. I mean, I'm mostly planting it for myself, not the insect, because now what happens when I plant this? Occasionally I'll see a black swallowtail coming by, and it will lay eggs, and then I might see the young stage of a parsley worm developing, but very uncommon now. And if I see it, it's probably not going to be there the next day because a European paper wasp swoops down and chews it into bug burger. And I don't know about your yard, but my yard, I have so many of these wasps that I don't butterfly garden anymore. I mean, I plant the flowers for the adults to support that part, but I don't plant plants to attract the larvae anymore because all of them are slaughtered. I mean, don't come to my yard. Don't lay your eggs here. It's a killing ground. Anyway, that's my problem. I don't know if it's your problem, but this European paper wasp is a game changer. I've not seen any insect that I think has affected Colorado backyard ecology more than that insect. And things really started changing mid 2000, 2004, 2005, 2006, and caterpillar numbers just crashed in many of the urbanized sites where this wasp became established. Anyway, that's kind of depressing. Let's move on to a different subject. Gardening for hummingbird moths. kind of magic moths that sometimes are confused with a hummingbird because they act like one. They're about the same size. They feed at flowers that a hummingbird may feed on, and they fly during the day. So this gets into a more detailed discussion that I need to get you through, and that is hummingbird moths and hornworms, because hornworms are the larval stage of hummingbird moths and other things. And hornworms do have some issues as plant pests. So let's work through this. Now, hornworms are large caterpillars. They most all of them have a horn at the end of the body. There is actually one that is hornless that is on the Virginia creeper, and two of them are pests of garden plants: the tomato hornworm and the tobacco hornworm. These insects, I think, do bother gardeners sometimes because, I mean, they not only eat a fair amount if it's on your tomato, but they are large and they have that scary looking horn on the hind end. The horn is just a flexible appendage, and I mean, it's only known function that I can think of is to scare a gardener. I think maybe you would be stung by it if it reared back and nailed you. It doesn't. It's just a flexible appendage. I mean, here's my kid playing with it when he's little, and he's blue, but that has nothing to do with the hornworm. He's just painting, and here he is years later, still doing fine. But there are a couple of hornworms that are an issue. There are two that get on your tomatoes. One is the tobacco hornworm, and the other is the tomato hornworm. And you may have both of them on your plant. The tobacco hornworm tends to be more common than the tomato hornworm, but you may have both on the same plant. And they'll lay their eggs on the plant. The adult is a big moth that we'll come back to. It lays its eggs on the plant, and you get a little caterpillar, and the egg hatches, becomes a bigger caterpillar, becomes a bigger caterpillar, becomes a bigger caterpillar, bigger caterpillar, eats a whole lot. And then when it's done, it goes into the ground and tamps out a little cell, maybe a couple inches deep in the soil. Likes loose soil, but your garden soil might be fine for it. Maybe maybe you're spading some of these up in the spring now. It might look like a cigar or something. It's got a little beak off the front often, and that's going to be the mouth parts of this when it turns into a moth. So hornworms are going to, when they transform to the adult stage, turn into a kind of moth we call a sphinx moth. And sphinx moths are big moths. They're among the biggest moths that we have in this region. And they're strong flyers, and most all of them only fly at night. All of them do fly at night, except one small group. And most all of them only fly at night, so we don't see them. But a small number of sphinx moths do fly during the day, or at least fly during the day and fly at night. But if a sphinx moth flies during the day, it is given this popular name, hummingbird moth. It's not a scientific name. It's just a pop name that we use for a day flying sphinx moth. So, do we have a conflict here? A lot of times, I think people like to see hummingbird moths. I mean, it's a kind of a magic insect, buzzing about, looking like a hummingbird. Sometimes very common if we have a large number of them, and that's a desirable thing. And then you tell them the hummingbird moth, the young stage is a hornworm, and they go, oh my gosh, I know about hornworms. I don't like hornworms. They're on my tomatoes. And is this a conflict? It's not a conflict. So why is it not a conflict? So there, first you have to understand there's lots of kinds of hornworms in the state, and most of them aren't pests. So there's hornworms on an elm tree. There's hornworms on an ash tree. There's hornworms on your poplars. Nobody ever worries about these. They chew on some leaves, but nobody even notices them. And then there's also this white-lined sphinx, which feeds on plants that normally we don't care about. Now, getting back to why this isn't a conflict, remember most sphinx moths only fly at night. And by definition, they would therefore not be a hummingbird moth. They may fly the same way, but it's at night, so you don't see it, so they're not a hummingbird moth. And that includes the two species, the only two species that are really a crop pest, the tomato hornworm and the tobacco hornworm. So they do not fly during the day. The one that you see almost always is the one on the lower right. That's called the white-lined sphinx, and that is the most common hummingbird moth of the western U.S. and is common throughout most of North America. Which got a strong white band on the wing, little pink underwing, and it is one in the caterpillar stage that feeds on plants that we largely don't care about. I mean, it's on purslane. I'm trying to get rid of purslane in my garden. Loves that. It does feed a little on grape, but we never see that. Probably the one plant where it may be a conflict is it likes to feed on evening primrose. That and a flea beetle are two common insects that develop on evening primrose in our gardens. But it's not really, I think, an insect that we would consider a pest because most of the things it feeds on are things we don't care about, and it never damages much, even if we did care about it. Then there are a couple of odd hummingbird moths, if you will, that are a little bit different. And these are called the bumblebee clearwing sphinx moths, and these only fly during the day. And they have an appearance more or less like a big bumblebee. And we have got a couple of different species, much less common than the white-lined sphinx, but these are an oddball thing too, and you might see some of these around, so keep your eyes open. And were you to want to plant a garden to attract and the visitation of hummingbird moths, there's certain kinds of plants that I would suggest you consider for a palette in your planting. Things that usually are fairly deep because these have got extremely long mouth parts. I mean, these can reach into kinds of flowers that other kinds of moths can't reach. So things that I have seen them visit are four o'clocks and primrose, larkspurs, datura, some of the agastache honeysuckle. And these are all things, and many of these are also visited by hummingbirds. Now, switching gears a little bit, there is a moth situation that maybe we don't want to have as much of. And this involves an insect called the army cutworm. And the army cutworm is going to turn into what people around here often call the miller moth. This is far more of an issue east of the Continental Divide than west. But let's talk about this interesting little moth. Now, it is a cutworm, and a cutworm is a type of caterpillar, usually gray-brown, that feed at or below the soil line, often will cut plants. And this is the most common spring-feeding cutworm of the region. You find them on all sorts of places. Winter wheat, alfalfa, gardens, lawns. They coil up when you find them. There's one right there. So they're a spring feeder, and when they're done, and this may be happening sometime in May, they'll go into the ground and they'll pupate. There's a picture of a pupa, much smaller than the pupa of a hornworm, and then they come out. And in this part of the country, when they come out, we call them a miller moth. Now, the term miller moth is not a scientific term, not similar to hummingbird moth. It's a popular term, and it's a popular term given to whatever kind of moth is locally common. So my brother in San Francisco has a miller moth. It's not the army cutworm. It's some local California thing. But ours is usually the adult stage of the army cutworm. And why do we call them miller moths? That is a term that is applied to any species of moth that's locally abundant, and the reason it's called a miller is that a person who mills grain is a miller. And if you mill grain, you get flour on everything. And so moths produce lots of scales that get on things. Millers get flour on them. Anyway, it's analogous to all the flour that might get on the smock of a miller, someone who mills grain. Anyway, when this army cutworm has turned into the adult, it does not then turn around and lay eggs. Most cutworms do. Most insects do right after they turn into the adult. At this time of year, they turn around and lay some eggs, but not this one. They then go on a journey, and their task is to follow the flowers and stay cool. They are not going to lay eggs for months. So they follow the flowers and stay cool, and they want to follow the flowers because these are going to be sources of nectar. They want to build up their fat reserves, and they want to stay cool. And how do you do that? You head for the mountains. So every spring, we see this annual migration across the eastern plains to the mountains, and they will spend the summer in the mountains. And these will migrate hundreds of miles. I mean, some of the ones that are reaching the mountains here are coming from places in Nebraska and Kansas. And Here in town, I always know when they have come into town in spring, when all of a sudden I see these swallows dive bombing the intersections. I mean, that every single time has been a tip off that they're here. And why are they here? Why are they in the intersections? Because these moths get into our cars, and they get into the chassis. They get sometimes in the cab, and when you stop at the light, I see moths boiling out. They've got disturbed, and while you were driving around, the car stops. They come out. They get them, or they're flying around the cab, and you're bothering you, and you roll down the window and you push them out at the intersection. And anyway, it's just like pizza delivery all day long. The swallows figure this out immediately and will home in. Anyway, that's another story. But the issue with Miller moths is that in the daytime they seek cover. They're active at night. In the daytime they seek cover, and they get into little cracks and crevices, and that could be little cracks and crevices around a window or around a door or underneath a door, or some kind of opening that allows them then to get inside. And then they get into your home. Some of them get into the home, and then some of them get into your vehicle through some little crack or crevice, and that can drive people nuts. Within a home, these army cutworm moths do not feed on anything. They don't lay any eggs. They don't do anything other than they're a moth in the house. But that's enough for many people. There's some people who cannot stand moths. I mean, they may be fine with spiders or snakes, but a moth flying around the house, that drives them crazy. Anyway, so the big thing is they're a significant nuisance. If we have a large number coming through, then we have a large number in the house. Now, fortunately, over the last 4 years, we have had very low numbers by historical standards in eastern Colorado, but they'll be back. Who knows? Maybe they'll be much more prominent this year. It's to be determined. But when they're done summering up in the mountains, like any good Coloradoan, they then migrate back to the plains and in September, and that is when the eggs will be laid. So the whole time they're up there in the mountains, they're sipping on nectar, staying cool, hunkered down under some loose rocks or something, and then building up the fat reserves to lay the eggs. But those eggs are not going to be laid until the following September, maybe even early October. Now, the question comes up often, why do I have more Miller moths in my house than my neighbor? And I think the reason for this is landscaping. I hate to say it, but these moths are seeking nectar sources at night. And if you have lots of nectar sources in your yard, then they will stay in your yard. And then when they go to seek shelter at the end, as dawn approaches, well, the shelter might be cracks and crevices of your house rather than somebody else's house. So there's certain kinds of plants that I see them on often if they come through early, and usually they don't. But things like lilac, chokecherry, and prunus are going to be fed on by these. Often they come later than that. Spirea euonymus. I didn't even know euonymus had flowers. They were so small, but I found the Miller moths just covering this. If you want one flower, though, I think that they really like is Russian olive. Now, this is a late flowering tree, but it is extremely attractive. So if you wanted to have Miller moths in your yard, or you wanted to create a landscape so that somebody you didn't like had Miller moss, this is what I'd recommend. Your palette of plants, particularly put a bunch of Russian olive in there if you could. And then the other thing is they may wish to have some cover. So you'll see Miller moths resting during the day in a dense evergreens and sheared shrubs and the like. Okay, so let's move on to a separate subject, and this is landscaping for natural enemies of other insects, biological control agents. So the principles for gardening for natural enemy biocontrol insects would be, to start with, I'd say learn to recognize them and don't kill them, because some of these have an appearance that many people don't recognize. Then provide food needs for the adults and provide food needs for the immature stages, and nest sites if required. So the first thing is learn to recognize them and don't kill them. Now, why do I say that? That's because many insects that we recognize commonly, like a lady beetle, in the young stage look very different because they have complete metamorphosis. So, lady beetle life cycle, we all know the adults, but they're going to lay eggs. The eggs are less familiar to people. But more importantly, the eggs will hatch into larvae that are feeding on lots of insects. So lady beetles lay masses of eggs near sources of food for their young, and then the eggs will hatch, and then you'll have these larvae. And the larvae look very different than the adults, but these are the eating machine. This is the stage of a lady beetle that you want to be feeding on the insects in your yard. The adults are feeding on a few, these are feeding on a lot, and they look really different. I mean, when people see a lady beetle larva crawling around a plant and they don't know about this, they assume the worst. They think this is some sort of plague or something, and they spray or they pick them off. Anyway, learn to recognize them. Provide food needs for the adults if they need it, and most do. So, for instance, lady beetle adults, which we recognize, they're feeding on few insects or various stages of insects, but most of them switch off and feed on nectar and pollen. That's what sustains them. They need energy source from the nectar, and the pollen might provide some vitamins and fats and the like. So for them to sustain themselves for long, you want to have certain flowers that are going to be allowing them to survive for longer, and they'll stick around if these flowers are there. Green lacewings, another kind of predator that we've talked about in Master Gardener. The young stage is the predaceous stage, so they're incredible predators of lots of kinds of garden insects, but the adults, they switch off. They're feeding on nectar and pollen. That group, the flower flies, a group of flies that look very much like bees or wasps sometimes, their larvae are predators of many kinds of insects or many kinds of aphids, top aphid predators, and they sustain themselves on nectar, maybe a little bit of pollen, but mostly nectar in order to keep going. And then, this is a general principle for pretty much all of the natural enemy species we wish to encourage in our yards, that the adult stages use plants as food sources, either for nectar or nectar and pollen. Having these kinds of plants in the yard will allow them to survive longer, and they'll stick around your yard. And if they're not there, they'll go somewhere else or they'll die prematurely. Another group that feeds on nectar and pollen are these parasitoid wasps. There's lots of these wasps that develop on different kinds of insects, and they lay their eggs in or on that insect, and their young develop in it, and the adults, they're switching off to nectar and pollen. And ditto with the tachinid flies, that other group of natural enemies we talked about in Master Gardener. The adult fly, they're sustaining themselves on primarily nectar, sometimes pollen. And as an example of why this is important, for those of you in the part of the state that have Japanese beetle, we're trying to introduce a couple of things that will attack the Japanese beetle, and one of them happens to be a tachinid fly. It lays its eggs on the adult Japanese beetle, and the eggs hatch, and then the young stage of that then goes in and kills the Japanese beetle. However, for this fly to be effective, it requires being able to access throughout the entire time it's laying eggs, flowers that it can feed on to get the nectar pollen. And if these kind of flowers are not there, they don't live long. They don't lay very many eggs. So we are only releasing these in sites where there's good flower abundance of the right kind in late June and July. And what are the kinds of flowers that are accessible by these natural enemies? They are almost always little tiny flowers. The lady beetles, the lacewings, these tachinid flies, none of these have big mouth parts. They need to have nectar that's right available. So think tiny flowers. Those are the kind of plants to put into a landscape for these kinds of insects. So anything in the carrot family, Apiaceae, cilantro or ammi, Queen Anne's lace, dill, fennel, some yarrows, not all, not very many, but some sedums, some spurges, sweet alyssum, basket of gold, little tiny flowered herbs like thyme. These can be accessed by these kinds of insects and used as a adult food supplement. Some of the plants I put in my yard, I plant just because they've got good action. I mean, two of my personal favorites, they're both the carrot family, but moon carrot, genus Cecily or Ammi, oh gosh, there's so much stuff on those plants. Now, nesting needs for natural enemies are not common. So where you're going to see them is if you have a group of wasps called hunting wasps that capture prey and provision a nest with these captured prey. So kind of an obscure group, never get to talk about these. So hunting wasps, there's three families of wasps in this that we would call hunting wasps, and all of them have a habit of, in the adult stage, they are going to hunt for some kind of prey. So the mother is usually going to prepare first some sort of nest cell or site. It might be in the ground, it might be in a stem of a plant. Then she goes out and hunts a specific kind of insect prey that is what her young is capable of developing on. She hunts it. If she finds it, she paralyzes it, returns it to the nest cell. And then the larvae of these hunting wasps will consume the paralyzed prey that is provided by the mother. So, for an example, this is one of the very first hunting wasps I ever saw when I was out camping near Rifle once. So the picture in the upper left is the wasp that when I first noticed it, and it was actually filling in a hole that it had just kind of covering the entrance that it had previously excavated. Then it went away, and 15, 20 minutes somewhat later, I saw this wasp coming back. Only this time it's trundling some big caterpillar, big naked caterpillar, a cherry sphinx off a chokecherry tree. And it was paralyzed, and brings it back to the hole and opens the hole back up, and boop, the caterpillar was dragged back down into some little side chamber which had been prepared before, and then the egg would be laid on that caterpillar, and then the young wasp would consume that paralyzed caterpillar. This is one that nests in sandy sites. It goes after flies, the sand wasps and the bembex or microbembex wasp. They nest in sandy sites and hunt flies and maybe provision a cell with 3, 4, 5 kinds of flies. Three, four flies could be the same kind, but when there's enough to support one young, lays an egg on it, seals a cell, and makes another cell and packs it with flies. A pretty spectacular one, not too common, but is called the golden digger wasp. Also nests in the ground, and it's a predator of longhorn grasshoppers and katydids in particular. Rarely true grasshoppers, mostly the katydid group, and drags them into a hole in the ground. And then in mostly southeastern part of the state, you're going to see the cicada killer sometimes. Eastern plains more than anywhere else. The cicada killer is a beast of a wasp. It looks like a giant mutant yellow jacket from hell, and it makes a hole in the ground, maybe 12, 16 inches deep, with a big mound of soil around it, and then goes and hunts cicadas, particularly specifically the dog day cicadas, the big cicadas that make the loud buzzing in the trees. Again, if you're western Colorado, you don't get to see all this stuff, but this is a eastern Colorado issue. Then there's other ones too. So this was an interesting one that Darren Davidson and I saw in Longmont a couple of years ago, where these wasps were nesting in a sandy site in a playground at a park. Um, and looking into this, it was kind of interesting. This is a wasp that nests in sandy soils, makes a little tunnel about 7 inches down. It kind of makes a little elbow. And then it provisions little side chambers with the prey that its young feeds on. And this wasp goes after stinky bugs. Bugs we call stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs. And here's, let's see if I can get this to play here. Here's a little video of that playground right here. So the sand was just right, and you see all these wasps flying back and forth. Look pretty scary. These are non-aggressive wasps, by the way. Most of the ones flying around are males that can't sting. To get stung, you would have to grab a female and put it on your skin. But they look kind of freaky. But there's one that's digging its little hole. And then they go out and they go collect the kind of prey that this one goes after, and this one goes after again stink bugs, or stinky bugs. This one's got a western conifer seed bug, and those are stinky bug that we sometimes see in our houses. Anyway, so this is the kind of things we would get out of those nest cells in that playground there. And then one that might be more accessible and certainly a lot less scary looking to people would be there's these tiny little wasps that nest in the pith of plants. So you have a pithy plant like a caneberry or a raspberry or a rose or butterfly bush or something, and you cut the branch. Often later you will see something going in and excavating the pith of there, and they're nesting in this. So these Pemphirodon wasps are the ones I have most in my yard, and they hunt small insects, aphids. I think all of them, this group feeds on aphids. Others go after small flies, different little tiny hunting wasps that nest in the pith of plants. They're not borers. They don't tunnel into the live tissue. They're just using the pith if it becomes available to them. So there they are. There's one nesting actually in the bamboo cane there. But these are not, again, borers. They're pith nesters. And I don't have a picture of the nest cells where they were full of prey, but the one in the lower left has a larva and a pupa of the wasp after it's consumed all the prey that had been in there. So there's nothing left except a few body fragments of what it fed on. Had I got it earlier, there might have been 15, 20 paralyzed aphids or leafhoppers in those little cells. And one thing that you might do to see the action of these is go out and provide some nest habitat for them. I'm doing this right now, is pruning my yard, and if I've got some pithy plants, some raspberries or again, a butterfly bush is one, and if I've got one that's got pith, and I'm pruning it right now, I keep them and then I stick them around and put them in the garden, and every single one of them in my yard gets occupied by something. So here's a little condominium project for pith nesting wasps, something you might be able to do right now. Others are a little bit different habit. There's one interesting group called the grass-carrying wasp, and these hunt tree crickets, the little crickets that make a song up in the trees in late summer. They hunt those, and then they paralyze them and pack them into cells they find. In the case here is a pre-drilled block of wood, and then they pack the area around them with grass. Another place you might see these is along the little tracks of windows on the outside, if it's just the right diameter. So here's some grass-carrying wasps that are nesting in those kinds of sites. So these are things you may see, and those again go after the crickets, the tree crickets. And then one of the last groups are wasps that make mud nests. So these ones actually construct a nest, the mud daubers, and we now have two species of mud daubers in Colorado. The one we've always had is the black and yellow mud dauber. It's a pretty big wasp. It's got a very long, thin area between the thorax and the abdomen, and it will construct mud nests of cells. So there'd be elongate cells, and there may be many of them clumped together. And this is created by collecting mud and then forming these cells. It might take 30 visits to form one cell, maybe even more. But once they have got a cell constructed, then they go out and hunt. And what mud daubers all hunt are spiders. So in this case, here's a mud dauber nest. You can see in the upper left, and on the upper right is this one was catching crab spiders, packed with crab spiders. And then an egg would be laid in that cell, and then the young would feed and consume all of those spiders in a very short period of time. A young of the wasp is in the lower left here. And then when they're done, they spin a little cocoon and usually don't come out until the next year. The picture on the lower right is the mud nest taken off the building, and that cellophane-looking brown material is the envelope of the pupa. And often they will stay as a larva through the winter and then pupate the next spring. By the way, there is one new kind of mud dauber, and that has gotten into Colorado, and it is known at least from these areas, both on the west slope and eastern Colorado, El Paso, Denver, Larimer. Got one. Should put Boulder in there too, and this is going to make these little jug-shaped cells, and a very popular place is around window wells. There's just the right kind of cavity for them. So this is one to watch for. Call it the Asian mud dauber. They're just collecting mud from the ground, and there's some nest cells in the windows. And what they are feeding on are spiders. This one goes after certain kinds of hunting spiders, the running crab spiders or some of the jumping spiders, and they will fill that cell with those spiders, and then the young will feed on it and then make a little cocoon and transform to the adult stage. So I'm still looking for mud daubers, by the way, of this species, this new one. But what I particularly want is the cells with the spiders. I'm looking for what kind of spiders are being attacked by this. So if you happen to see some of these during the year and they are still intact, perhaps give me a shout, and maybe we can get some samples of what are actually the kind of spiders in there. Get some numbers on this to describe this new insect. Again, this Colorado, as far as I'm aware, is still the only state that has this insect. It's also known in Quebec. In this whole subject, by the way, there is an excellent publication that I would recommend. Goes along with this latter thing on improving habitat for natural enemy species. It's produced by the Xerces Society, which is an outstanding organization that's dedicated to issues related to conserving invertebrates, insects for the most part, and relatives in North America. By the way, another thing, if you're interested in this subject, you may wish to search on the do an internet search on conservation biological control. So conservation biological control is often what this whole field of improving habitat for natural enemies is discussed. And that's it. Yeah, I do have a second part on bees. I'll be doing in just a little bit, but want to point out, if this year the things are coming out, if you find interesting bugs in your yard and photograph them, I'd like to see them. And oftentimes master gardeners find things that I've never seen and take better pictures than I take. So anyway, there's my email, and again, there's a part 2 that we just talk about bees. So hope you're doing well, and get out in the garden when you can.